very much for your introduction and for this nice invitation. It's a great pleasure to speak at this salon. And at the same time, it's a huge challenge to squeeze a topic like that into 45 minutes. And in the beginning, I would like to ask who in the room has seen this earlier presentation that was kindly linked to the invitation to the, what was it called? When you registered for this. So some have seen it, some have not seen it. Okay, so because I was a little bit in this tension of, shall I repeat an earlier thing that is still valid totally, or shall I maybe go a bit deeper? And I chose to do the latter. And yes, to take a little bit of a broader view on the developmental lens on politics, which is such a neglected perspective, at least in mainstream discourse, even though it can shed so much light on so many important dimensions in almost all our conflicts and challenges, because it brings in the vertical axis really and helps to distinguish horizontal change from vertical transformative challenges. So I'll somehow try to put 4 presentations in one, let's say 4 aspects that I find important with regard to this question, shall we or why shall we not negotiate with Russia? And as Elke has mentioned, I do have a background in Russian studies, but I no longer have a research position with relation to Russia right now. It's maybe part of the tragedy of integralists to be ahead of our time. And at the time, mainstream academia was just not interested and not ready for integral approaches. But of course, I have been continuing to follow Russian events, and sadly enough, my analysis from many years ago have proven correct. And while they didn't have a lot of resonance at the time, they're now at the heart of the so-called Zeitenwende. So, well, late honor. So I'll share my screen, and I hope you can see it. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So my hunch is that in this audience, I don't really have to convince anyone that negotiations with Putin and with Putin's Russia are a bad idea. So I would rather deepen the focus a bit and start by the following questions. Oops, no, I'll skip the advertisement block, which you mentioned already, thankfully. So these are some of the guiding questions that I find interesting. First of all, well, what is the call for negotiations with Russia all about? What are the needs behind? And then spend some more time on questions like, well, what is at stake after all? Meaning, who are we actually dealing with in Russia? How is this country functioning and why? And based on that, what could be alternative and more creative options that we can come up with? As to the call for negotiations in the West, this seems to be about the wish to go back to the not so distant, seemingly good old times where we had intensive trade relations, especially in Germany, cheap energy, and where things weren't as bad east of us as they are now with the implications of the war. So we could quietly ignore what is going on inside Russia as long as we are okay. Unfortunately, that view has never been very smart, but it has now also proven very naive, as we are seeing Russia sitting at the longer lever, using its energy and its nuclear power also to blackmail and to manipulate more or less everybody else, keeping agreements only when they are not in the way of some more important policy aims that I will come to in a moment. In turn, for Russia, negotiations would, of course, imply to somehow accept the status quo. In other words, at least some of the results of Russia's illegal attack on Ukraine, and hence to legalize its violent rise above the law. So essentially, what is at stake here is international law as the only legitimate instance to regulate international affairs, as opposed to a return to 19th century geopolitics. And this is a conflict on a vertical scale, I would say, not just a horizontal conflict between 2 parties, which makes it interesting from a developmental point of view. So unless you fancy geopolitics, negotiations in the conventional sense of the word, I give you something, you give me something, are not an option, given that it was Russia who has moved beyond that level of negotiations, taking the conflict to the military level of war in the first place. So the core question behind this quest for negotiations is rather something like, what else could we do? How should we respond to this current escalation in view of putting the standard of international law back into place? And this implies to ask, who are we dealing with in Russia? How is this country functioning? And this goes way beyond Putin as a political leader, which is why I chose to go a little bit deeper. Because the fact that he is so successful in Russia, despite all the internal and external violence, the fact that such a leader has been possible at all to a considerable degree has to do with some features of Russian society and of Russian history that will likely prevail or change only very incrementally even if Putin was no longer in office. So we have to have those in mind as well. And I will start with a broader, deeper structural perspective, a question that has driven me to study Russia from the start, namely, what kind of change can we or can we not expect in Russia or from Russia? And how can we possibly live in peace with this country, assuming that domestic politics and external relations are closely related? This also implies that we need to ask, well, or I have been asking myself, how on earth can post-Soviet Russia move towards a more liberal version of democracy? Well, it's not a democracy right now, but yeah, how could it move in this direction? And here is the first disclaimer from a developmental perspective. In theory, of course, every country has the right to develop at its own pace, as long as they don't take everybody else hostage and dictate their rules to everybody else on the planet, more or less, which is happening right now. So unfortunately, yeah, this is happening with unheard of violence towards humans and also towards nature. So in some sense, these considerations are coming a bit late. At the same time, with world peace at stake, we do need to respond. So in order for us to do that based on a more realistic picture of who we are dealing with, I would like to look at some of these deeper constraints and at what could possibly be done to help Russia eventually remove these constraints and grow up, as integralists might maybe say. So at the last salon, Alexander Etkin has focused on some structural and some economic aspects of the Russian imperialism. So I would like to focus a bit more on the realm of political culture with those 4 dimensions that I find very meaningful to understand the stakes in this conflict. And it's not a complete picture, of course. There would be many more that would deserve a separate attention, but yeah, 45 minutes. So I will start with some of the stakes beyond Putin as a person, assuming that even if he disappeared as a leader in however way, that might not be the end of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine or the West, given some of the deeper root causes of this problem. And since time is short, and I have already addressed Putin's action logic as a leader in this other presentation that you kindly linked to the invitation, I might skip part of that today or summarize it maybe just briefly and focus on some of my earlier work on Russian history, political culture and society in a more like, let's say, longue durée perspective. That's a term by the French historian Fernand Braudel. As a young German political scientist, for me, it was all about trying to understand what are the specific factors that seem to be in the way of Russia taking a more peaceful, a more democratic path. And that somehow is my second disclaimer, if I might say. In the German social and political sciences, you cannot avoid the topic of our undemocratic past and the idea of the quality of German democracy being a function of the depth and the seriousness of Germany's efforts to really come to terms with it, which has some similarities with the Russian one, by the way. For instance, if we think of the idea of the German Sonderweg, so-called Sonderweg, a special path, the long-lasting belief that Germany was different from the West, identifying itself in opposition to this West, essentially until World War II, which has parallels. I just need to remove this window here a little bit, which has parallels in Russia's conflict between the Westerners and the Slavophiles way back in the 19th century, and the latter's idea on being on a specific mission as a third Rome and so on. I won't go into this, but there are these parallels. So taking a developmentally informed historical perspective, even though a nation might see itself as being on a Sonderweg, being different from the West, or from, yeah, let's say from the West, analytically, this idea is nothing special. It's a typical expression of traditional, somehow ethnocentric thinking, we might say, that lacked the capacity to open up its own identity enough to see all sorts of interrelations and commonalities. So this developmental perspective also implies to take a comparative look at questions like, how has Russia's path been different or specific from others? What have been the historical roots of liberal democracy in the West? Are any of these present in Russia? And if not, what does it mean? What is at stake in Russia? What are obstacles or specific challenges for democracy there? And there are two quotes that came to my mind when looking at this. And the German example shows that a conscious shift towards different democratic values is possible, but also that it's necessary and that it's a precondition for building up a new political system based on these Otherwise, if you don't take an integral, all quadrants kind of view on social political development, you might well introduce a new system, but everything stays the same. And those are the two quotes here. One is from France, from after the revolution, and the other one is from Russia. And they both say, well, we try to change something, but it came out as it comes out all the time. If you don't change the inner quadrants at the same time with the change of the institutions, that's what happens. And I love this this last quote here by one of the very few political scientist that is developmentally informed, Stephen Chilton in the US, saying, unless institutions are preserved by people at the appropriate stage, the institutions will regress to less developed forms. And my first claim in this regard is that basically there's no relevant living historic experience with regard to liberal democracy in Russian society that it could draw on after the end of the Soviet Union, neither from before nor during Soviet times. And my second claim is what was completely missing in particular was Western or Orange's liberal idea of a free, self-defining individual striving for improving one's own condition, not just economically, but also as a citizen with equal rights and guaranteed freedoms based on the rule of law. In contrast, Western countries had experienced a plurality of paths toward their current model of democracy, with cultural roots and processes sometimes going back several hundred years. And here's just a very, very superficial look at some of those specifics that have shaped different political cultures in Russia and the West. I won't go through each point here, just mention that in the West, we had both institutional and cultural experiences of pluralism, of power being limited by balancing out each other. We had citizens developing and being supported in developing their own literacy to a very large degree comparatively. We had a moral pluralism, a religious pluralism as a basis for critical thinking. We even had Western churches urging believers to do good in the outside world for self and others as a way to express their faith, as opposed to what happened in the Orthodox Church. And this also had them work for more political and economic freedom, justice, and self-determination. In contrast, in Russia, we had social, political, and economic backwardness, and that's a sociological term, it's not an evaluation, caused by institutional and cultural monopolies, by the lack of personal and political rights and freedom, the lack of support for this worldly personal growth and development. The Orthodox Church was and still is pretty much oriented towards salvation in the afterlife. So, I mean, what's happening here is not that important and doesn't get that much attention. And for that reason, there are very low incentives, or have been very low incentives in earlier times to improve, for example, literacy as a basis for critical thinking and building up personal independence. And there are essentially two interesting positive exceptions here in the Russian case. One is the liberal reforms by Alexander II, introducing a more or less independent judiciary, beginning of the 19th century, or middle of the 19th century, or the last part, let's say, with the beginning of the separation of powers. But this did not fully take root until the revolution of 1917, amongst other things, due to bureaucratic and cultural resistance. And there is a super interesting book by a colleague of mine who studied the bureaucrats' resistance towards something new, right? They wanted everything to stay the same. And the other example is the introduction of the Zemstvo, which was a system of local parliaments that started to give peasants a degree of self-determination that had an enormous impact on building the roots of an early form of civil society in Russia that would later also play a role in the revolutions of both 95 and 1917. And it has a little bit of a similarity, I would say, with the so-called the folk schools in Scandinavia that Thomas Björkman has described in his book, The Nordic Secret. Would be interesting to compare those. But both of these exceptions, both of these positive examples have, of course, been terminated by the Bolshevik Revolution. So we have just about 30, 40, maybe 50 years of very cautious, very early experiments and experience with some elements of law and local democracy in pre-Soviet times. And developmentally speaking, it was impossible in these conditions of autocracy and low cognitive development, literacy, to establish bureaucratic administration in a Weberian sense, in other words, based on proper rule of law. And why is that? Because from a developmental perspective, without basic literacy, there can be no formal operational thinking, Piaget. And without that, there can be no cognitive coordination of two or more abstract variables, for example, norms and behavior, right? Put my behavior in relation to the norms. In order for a person not only to conceive and understand the value of abstract rules, but to also observe and observe the rules and behave accordingly, they need formal, operational, or systemic, even that's the next level, systemic thinking. And I've done quite a few studies about that, looking at corruption in Russia. And it's quite an interesting topic also to look at from a developmental perspective. And here you have the correspondence between cognitive and moral development, which of course then is important for which institutions appear. And in turn, formal or post-formal systemic or meta-systematic cognition only evolves with secondary or higher education, which of course some elites had gone through in Russia, but not the broad population. So we have no substantial experience of the rule of law in pre-Soviet Tsarist Russia. And this is maybe a little bit difficult to read, but it's a more detailed extract from one of the papers that I've done about this whole issue. So what about the Soviet Union? In a nutshell, we all know that Soviet law was a variable of the ruling party's interest, and the question how to describe the Soviet system in a developmental regard would be a seminar of its own, which I won't dare to do here. But I would say that my earlier claim about Orange's liberal ideas of civic and political freedom missing is valid here too. And Alexander Etkind last time described Soviet modernity as paleo-modernity, also in his book. And he defines that as a powerful state subordinating both people and nature to a turbocharged modernity that, at least in comparison with Western modernity, remained selective as to the political and moral dimension. And in the social sciences, we speak of catch-up modernization, nachholende Modernisierung in German, with as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, with huge programs to speed up certain dimensions of progress in the entire country. They did a great job, of course, in fostering literacy and fostering science and technology development, but the educational agenda was deeply conventional, both in terms of content and in vertical structural regard. In other words, it was subject to the authority of the party line and did not encourage a broader personality development that would include post-conventional morality and critical thinking, because that, of course, would have undermined Soviet power. So this doesn't come back. So in spiral dynamics terms, we might describe it as an eclectic mix of some elements of orange belief in technology, some blue authoritarian order, while parts of Soviet society continue to operate on a more reddish kind of barter and bribery type action logic, partly because authority was lacking proper rule of law, as we discussed earlier. So I cannot go deeper into this, but it's a really interesting field of study. So here again, no lived experience of proper rule of law in Soviet times, and that means insufficient preconditions and difficult times for transformation towards democracy. Does this mean that law-based democracy is impossible? Of course not. But whatever institutions you introduce, they will always be functioning according to the level of development of the people that are running them. That was the quote by the US political scientist Stephen Chilton. And that's also why political culture, the whole lower left quadrant of transformation, is such an important dimension when we want to understand such big societal transformation processes. So the next dimension, the next three dimensions that you see here, they all have to do with political culture. And all of them are reasons why at least conventional negotiations, I give you something, you give me something, will not solve the problem. So I will start with the first one, Russia's national identity. And it being closely linked to its empire, its former empire. And this relates both to the pre-Soviet and the Soviet empire. Actually, there has never been a Russian nation without an empire. And what's more, as a colleague of mine, Ricarda Vultius at the University of Münster says, historically, in Russia, the process of nation building was disrupted by the existence of the Russian Empire. In other words, the empire existed before a genuinely Russian national identity could have formed. Therefore, Russian national identity is almost inconceivable without the empire. Or put still differently, Russia has no clear sense of a national self or a national identity beyond its former empire. And the reason for that is that the origins of the Russian state go back to the Kievan Rus, which was the heart center and cradle of Eastern Christianity. The baptism and the Christianization of the Kievan Rus in 998 was both the source of the Eastern Orthodox Church and a key unifying event of early Russian and East Slavic society. And it also gave birth to the first Russian state. So Russian history has indeed started in Kiev. Now, I've no time to go more deeply into early history, but what is important here is that the core idea behind this whole Kievan empire was that of the so-called all-Russian nation. While the empire included various different peoples living in this area, and a bit simplified, what you often hear is mainly the so-called Great Russians or the East Russians, the Little Russians, the later Ukrainians, and the White Russians, the Belarus Russians. And so yeah, it included all these different people, and there was this overarching narrative, the so-called unity paradigm, that saw all of them as one Orthodox nation. Later on, state building continued with various changing constellations of power and territory, also namely the differentiation of Eastern and Western Slavic entities and the emergence of the Principality of Moscow out of the Mongol Tatar rule as a separate independent entity at the end of the 15th century, while Kiev then was included into the Polish-Lithuanian Empire and took a whole different path, also culturally a whole different path. Until the division of Poland, there were 3 parts of the division of Poland, and with the 3rd division, the Russian Empire extended again to include Kiev, so it went back and forth. And so this Russian Empire included a whole lot of different peoples or tribes, not just ethnic or cultural Russians. So on the one hand, the 3 Russian peoples found themselves in different states at different points in history. But on the other hand, Russia itself was rarely ever identical with the territory of just the ethnic Russians, but has almost always been an empire that included many other peoples, I said that before, with this conception of the triune Russian people, the official state being the official state ideology until 1917. And the same was true in the Soviet Empire, more or less, where the Russian Republic was the largest and by far the most important republic, and therefore Russians for decades identified with Soviet politics as their politics, given that they de facto continued to be culturally dominant, including forced Russification. And despite a formally federalist and international self-description of the Soviet Union. Now, this tradition and practice has simply been picked up by Putin over the last years, based on the experience that the loss of the empire of the Soviet Union falling apart, with most former republics declaring themselves independent, one after another, and the right to secession, so to leave the Union, existed in the Soviet constitution, the so-called parade of sovereignties, where one republic after the other declared their independence, starting with Estonia in '88. So this produced a strange psycho-cultural void in Russia, combined with a somehow traumatic sense of loss or even betrayal, especially with the Western republics, the Baltic states, and in part also Ukraine, taking a more liberal pro-Western path. So this was somehow implying, or seemed to be implying, that Russia was not attractive anymore, not good enough, which is why it was experienced as a tragedy or even as a humiliation by many Russians. Very similar, by the way, to the German experience after Versailles. Now, I'm not justifying this in any way. It's just, I think, the reality at stake in cultural regard that we have to deal with on the level of political culture and political identity. So what is the problem with this? As I said, the right to secession, to leave the Union, existed in the Soviet constitution, even though at the time no one would have imagined this to ever be used. But with the Soviet Union imploding as a result of perestroika and glasnost, the glue and the violent control disappeared and the empire fell apart. And as to Ukraine, it is interesting to note that a referendum was held to confirm the declaration of national independence, and vast majorities, even in the so-called pro-Russian areas of Donbass and Luhansk in the southeast, even in Crimea, voted in favor of independence. And what you don't see here in the very bottom of Crimea, Sevastopol had 57% pro-independence. So these were the results in '91. Even though the Russian Republic, the RSFSR, had itself declared its independence from the Soviet Union even earlier, than Ukraine. This whole psychosocial complex of collective trauma has never really been processed in any adequate, in other words, transformative, let's say, healing way for many reasons. And we could say it has not been integrated as a historical fact by Russian society. And I will come to this dimension in a moment. And this experience is now at the heart of Putin's political identity, and it's a core driver of his politics. And as a side note, obviously, as you probably know, similar mindsets, imperialist mindsets and value systems of geopolitical thinking in spheres of influence and so on, they were quite common in the 19th century, in Germany, for instance, until almost, World War II. Moreover, they are a typical feature in rising traditional national states. And we see a little bit of that, at least that's my opinion, now in Poland and in Hungary, you know, with those moves back towards the more nationalist stance, which is now over, luckily, in Poland. But it might be something like a nachholende, I don't know that word in English, nachholende Nationsbildung. So yeah, late nation building. So why is this a problem? Apart from the fact that not addressing trauma means that it's going to be repeated, right? And the other reason is that quite simply and obviously because we are in the 21st century and not in the 19th century, and the world has changed quite a lot after World War I on international level. The League of Nations was formed in 1920, later the UN after World War II, putting in place international law that puts a radical and decisive stop to imperialist ambitions, in particular to using force to change borders. And the Soviet Union, as well as Russia as its legal successor, has adopted these standards too. So Russia's behavior very clearly runs against current international law. And here's a list of acts that either the Soviet Union or Russia itself have signed regarding its relation to Ukraine and the West, and you probably know those. So formally, the legal situation is very clear, but unfortunately, as we see again, and come back to the quote of Stephen Chilton many times here, if institutions such as international law are not preserved by people at the appropriate stage or with the appropriate cultural take on it, the institutions risk to regress to less developed forms. In other words, those people will come up with their own alternative interpretations of law and of history, which we see a lot in Russia, for justifying what they prefer to do, which developmentally speaking is a pre-conventional behavior. And Putin's war is very clearly a breach of international law. So if we want to maintain the international order protecting our liberal democracies, we cannot give in at this point. And interestingly, it was Mussolini who said there can be no compromise between democracy and totalitarianism. And the implications would be, well, if we gave in here, the implication would be the end of international law as we know it. So we see that this conflict is to a huge degree about worldviews and political culture, and on a vertical level, right, about complexities of worldviews. And as I said earlier, from a developmental perspective, it is okay for a person or a society to be at earlier, less complex levels, as long as it doesn't harm others, which it does here massively. If we let Russia act out its worldview in this way. So from an integral perspective, we might need to think about another upgrade of the international order, so to speak, that puts much clearer limits to ego or ethnocentric behaviors and much higher demands on people in power. How could we do that? I don't know, but the situation is calling for it, I think. Right. So the next reason why negotiations won't solve the problem is closely connected to the previous one and with Russia's relation towards its own history. In German, we have this term Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with undemocratic past. It's difficult to translate, but that's something that we in Germany had to learn through the painful lesson of a defeat in World War II, followed by an occupation, which at least, somehow it was more of a re-education, let's say, by the Allies. And it went in the direction of overcoming the Nazi heritage through a completely new start in terms of institutions and also in terms of political culture. And it was facilitated by the fact that Nazism had only lasted 12 years and that there was a sufficient number of counter elites available, partly coming back from forced immigration to take over the country and rebuild a more liberal democracy. That's for West Germany. In the eastern part, it was still a bit different with, this whole communist anti-fascism, which helped to put the blame outside and do much less of this self-critical work on Vergangenheitsbewältigung as it has been done in the western part. So the lesson of this experience that is very clear from a West German perspective is that the quality and the depth of democracy is a direct, more or less direct function of the degree of honesty and self-reflexivity with which a society does this work of coming to terms with its non-democratic past. And that can take many forms, and it should ideally cover all the quadrants in the integral model, from rebuilding new structures, new institutions, to re-establishing justice as much as possible, both towards those who have suffered from the past regime and towards those who have been actively involved in its crimes. And then the legal coming to terms then, of course, needs a mental cultural shift in the sense of making a symbolic break with the values of the old regime, while at the same time actively adopting a different set of values that is supportive of the new kind of democratic order that one wants to establish. This includes historical, scientific work. It includes in-depth study of the past, uncovering what has actually happened. It includes listening to people who have lived it, and so on and so forth. And then these informations need to be made known to the broad public via the media and the educational system in order to re-educate people really and help them gain a full picture of what the past regime was all about. As a way to then hopefully support their readiness to shift their worldview to something more peaceful, more tolerant, more democratic, which in Germany has taken decades, right? It wasn't fast, and it was a lot of work. And note that immediately after the war, citizens were even sometimes forced by the Western Allies to watch movies about the concentration camps or even to visit those camps as a way to force them to own these things as actual facts that Germany was responsible for and it was going to be held responsible for. And I'm not saying that this process has been perfect or complete or anything else, but it's just the most articulate example of this whole complex. So in a way, unfortunately, post-Soviet Russia was the product not of a military defeat, but of an internal implosion of a system that had simply become too dysfunctional to survive any longer. And it never had the equivalent of Allied winners who forced it to come to terms with the Soviet past. And as a result, this process has so far been very incomplete and very contradictory, with many, many myths and narratives about the good old times that have never really been officially deconstructed. On the contrary. So from this perspective, a military defeat of Russia could actually be helpful for Russian society to get more serious about doing this necessary shadow work on its own history and to become a normal country, as some would like to see it. So what happened instead in Russia after 1991? The very institutional regime change as a process was not straightforward. But it went more or less dancing back and forth for about 7 years, formally ending with the new democratic constitution, which was an institutional break with the previous setup in December 93. However, as you might remember, it occurred after a violent conflict between President Yeltsin and the still existing Soviet parliament, the Supreme Soviet. So already this institutional break with the Soviet Union was all but smooth and clear, hence not fully accepted as legitimate by everyone. So we had a very nice democratic constitution, by the way, written with support of Western consultants. But as you know, and I can quote Chilton again, it's no use to have super nice institutions if you don't have the people who sustain them at the appropriate level, right? So what was supposed to bring this great constitution alive? The task was huge. Economically, Russia faced complete breakdown with no experience in society beyond the Soviet one, no experience about economics, about the rule of law, we've mentioned that before, which is a precondition for both democracy and market economy to work, and much less about building up a new political system. And what's worse, after the end of communism, the country lacked a powerful vision for where to go and what else to build on the ruins of the Soviet Empire. It was completely unclear in the 1990s, in the early 90s, and later also, where Russia was going to be heading. And I remember that at some point, Boris Yeltsin, the president, he even set up a competition calling for a new idea for Russia because nobody knew what to focus on. So all quadrants were in need of deep change. And you see that, again, this is not just about Putin, who was a nobody back then, but about a whole society that would have needed to go through an unheard of transformation to build something sustainably more democratic, which has not happened so far. Rather, in a situation where nothing was working for about 8 years in the 90s, the idea of democracy having lost a lot of traction because it was related to chaos and instability, now Putin came in as a kind of hero, as a kind of savior, met by a fear-based society of subordinates, of mindset of subordinates, longing for somebody to sort it all out for them. And that was at the same time too afraid and also too inexperienced to step into its own power. So what did Russia's, what I call slow farewell from its Soviet past, that's the title of my dissertation, what did that look like more specifically? So we had a few things that are typically named as important elements of coming to terms with the past, with the non-democratic past, in green, and we had some things were missing. So we had this former regime change, we had a law to rehabilitate the victims and to give them some sort of compensation. That was good, but that's about it, right? We had no lustration, we had no criminal proceedings against anybody from the old elites. We had no new personnel, and there weren't any new elites existing, right? They have all been liquidated already in the 30s by Stalin, more or less. And the old elites still in power, and so on and so forth. So almost no dissidents in any relevant position. There was Sergei Kovalyov as the representative for human rights, but that's it, right? Everybody else came from the former Communist Party, more or less. There has been no equivalent of something like the Nuremberg trial or a public reappraisal of the Soviet past in a legal kind of way. My dissertation topic was actually about this so-called CPSU trial, which was more or less the only court proceeding that addressed this issue. It would be a long story to tell this, but it was really about Yeltsin banning the Communist Party. And at the same time, the question was the Communist Party constitutional according to Soviet law, right? And it came out in the trial that they produced many documents proving that the Communist Party didn't even observe its own constitution. So I'm quoting the judges here whom I have interviewed. They said it was completely clear by the documents, and it was shocking that they were completely criminal even in the late 80s. So that was one side of it. But then there was this huge political pressure on the judges, which had them end the trial on a compromise, yeah, because they feared that if they would come up with the verdict saying, well, the Communist Party was unconstitutional and so on, this would produce a revolution, and the country would sort of break apart or whatever. So as a result of this compromise, there is no official position about what post-Soviet Russia should, how it should evaluate the Soviet Union, which means that all narratives are allowed, all narratives are legitimate, including a restoration of previous views. And that's what's happening now. There has been some historical study. Memorial was a very important actor, and it was mostly driven by these private actors and some people at universities, but not the majorities. There was no public support for this kind of work. On the contrary, public support went to other directions, and even they started closing the archives again. So a very, very, very poor record here. And the result is that, yeah, this in this not decided situation opened the door for a restoration that we see now. Right, and so the result is a return to, yeah, more or less a restoration, we could say. On the institutional level, but also on other levels. And here you have one of those interesting ways of Stephen Chilton to look at, well, how is development related to political institutions, and how and which levels of development bring forward which kinds of institutions and what is possible at which level. So we basically see that this whole restoration has reproduced a neo-feudal state, more or less, with all the characteristics of pre-conventional social relations and institutions. And I have also borrowed this nice slide by Elke from his last presentation, which also shows this. So we're talking about, can you see my mouse, about this area here? And so the regression is more or less to the somewhat safe basis of what works, even though at high costs, no human rights, lack of freedom. And this has been a more or less conscious choice by Russian voters time and again since Putin came to office. But since Russian society has hardly known better, we have to say, that seems to be an acceptable choice for the majority there. And that's the lower left quadrant, consequences of this restoration here. So I have also looked at this phenomenon from the perspective of Susanne Cook-Reuter's leadership maturity framework, which I find very helpful for looking at the politics of history as a topic, because that's about national identity. So you get all the questions there that you would also find in an individual that develops their identity, like who am I, what is my relation to others, and so on and so forth. And so that's a very nice tool to explore the politics of history. And I cannot go through all those levels here, of course, but developmentally speaking, this politics of history that we see under Putin, it consists more or less of not dealing with the past, of not working it through, but rather cherry picking what confirms one's identity or what least threatens the identity. And this corresponds to a pre-conventional, or what Susanne Cook-Reuter would call a self-protective action logic that is essentially unable to take others' interests, needs, or emotions into account, and hence is unable to build more stable, constructive relationships with others. And in this slide, you have the same points a bit bigger. So it is pre-conventional because its primary focus is not conventions or rules, but self-interest, regardless of the implications on others or on the larger whole, which is just not a relevant category for it. So while it might enter negotiations as a means to reach its goals, we cannot trust or expect it to observe rules or conventions, agreements, etc., in which it has to compromise. And that's not so much for bad will, but it's really for the lack of competence to build more stable, more trust-based relationships. And that is both the summary of why we cannot negotiate with this kind of actor, and also of my analysis of Putin's leadership profile, which would have been the fourth dimension, but which I'd rather tend to leave out here because probably my time is already up. Beyond maybe the claim that Putin's Russia is about restoring an idealized past as a way to preserve personal power and to not have to confront trauma as a person, because he's very much identified with this past, and also as a society, because this would require to make yourself vulnerable, and showing empathy, of course, would also be related to this vulnerability. So if you start to negotiate with somebody with this mindset and value system, it is not about finding agreements, but it's about their self-interest, or one's self-interest. And I have here maybe just an overview version of some of the most important results or the most important descriptions of this self-protective personality profile, which I think, or we have found, best describes Putin's behavior as a political leader. So with these kinds of personalities, you cannot expect any goodwill beyond their own will. You cannot expect them to keep any promises if these run counter their will. You cannot expect respect from them unless you demonstrate your strength by the power of domination. So negotiating in this conventional sense, you give me something, I give you something, on the horizontal level is counterproductive, because anything they get from you will be like a victory for them. So the question arises, what alternative options are there? And the easy answer is maybe speak their language, right? To be understood, speak their language. And there are some hints if we look at both Claire Graves' description of this, what he calls the CP, or the red, later in Spiral Dynamics, level of existence, or also in Susanne Krug-Reuter, they have recommended certain strategies as the most effective ones to deal with these kinds of personalities. And the bottom line, I think, is here on the right side of the table. You have to be very, very firm. And then eventually you can start some kind of re-educating method, and which can be described maybe as a carrot and sticks method, because your response must be based on a very clear power position and determination to never, never let them get away with non-desired behavior, making crystal clear what the rules are, and you must not admit any doubt about these. Pretty much the same behavior that the Allies showed towards post-war Germany. And I would have some ideas maybe what that could mean more concretely. But as a closing remark, maybe this would be necessary, and on that basis, then you can maybe eventually, after a process of restoring justice, you can maybe start to make space for the idea of something like a transformative justice, or transformative kind of negotiation, the carrots and sticks methods. In other words, to offer avenues for Russia to regain respect based on observing the rules and based on paying for the damage that it has caused. So much from me, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elke. Right. Okay. I love it how you've put, made more links to spiral dynamics than in previous conversations we've had. So it feels like you're integrated more into it. And I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Any questions? Anybody?
We have the chat and no questions there. Was maybe a little bit too much. I'm sorry.
No, no worries. No worries. Let it sink in for a moment. Okay, Leila, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the whole view. I was wondering, you said what is needed is for the other side to get a kind of dominating position. So firm stand, strong. Does that mean that we have to win the war?
Well, maybe I can just add my 3 points that could be examples of how this could look like, right? International law is very clear in this regard. It allows to help countries that have been attacked, right? So there's no doubt about this. And any doubt that comes up in the discourse is fear-based, right? But you must not show fear in these situations. So there could be three possible avenues for action. One is, of course, send everything that you can possibly send to help to work towards a military defeat of Russia, which is not out of reach, right? It's just if Germany finally sent those Taurus things, the Crimea bridge could be disrupted, and that would be the end of their supply chain, right? That would be quite easy to do. Another thing, stop anything that supports the Russian regime to stay alive. I mean, I'm not an economist, but we heard last time about those Danish pilots who are still helping Russian oil ships to go through the Baltic Sea, which is incredible, right? Why couldn't we stop this? Would have a huge effort, a huge impact. And then maybe one more point, we should become much more creative in terms of using all sorts of tech strategies, can be cyber strategies, to support both the former 2 points and to also reach the Russian population, or at least to seed doubts about the official narrative about the West. It's also pretty much the same as what the Allies did in Germany, right? They threw leaflets from planes to re-educate people and to tell them a different story, right? There should be so many more possibilities in the digital age. I'm not an expert in technology, but I mean, where is the creativity? I don't see it. But we must turn around Russian public opinion in order to reach any kind of lasting solution here. And the floor is open for creative ideas, right?
Thanks. Okay, Barbara, you have put your hand up also.
Did I hear you at the end talk about reparations as being something that you think should be pushed on Russia?
Of course, yeah.
I was always taught that World War II was essentially caused by the Brits and the French forcing reparations on Germany. So does it just not lead to a deeper and deeper hole?
I'm not sure about the reparations after the First World War, which I'm not an expert of this period of history. Maybe those were just a little bit too high and just a little bit too, and the way they were, put onto Germany. I don't know, but it's clear that there has to be some sort of payment, and in whatever form. I mean, it can be all sorts of forms, but already, I mean, there are huge sums that have been confiscated by the sanctions, and Russia has to pay for this in some way. It doesn't mean we have to destroy it, but which was also, we can learn so much from what happened after the Second World War. The US helped Germany. They put up the Marshall Plan. They did how do you call, they bombed candies, right, to lift public opinion and so on and so forth. It's not about destroying it, but it's about being very clear about what the rules are, and there's no stepping back from these rules, because otherwise we can forget civilization, right?
Yeah.
And that's not happening right now. It's much too fluffy, what we see. And international law is quite clear in this regard. So we do have a basis to legitimize this. There should not be a question about this.
It's interesting because a lot of what you're saying there is like a very clear, healthy blue layer in all what's happening here from a spiral dynamics point of view,
Yes,
right?
and
So,
healthy blue is the
yeah.
target level of self-protective actors, right? They can only do the next step, and the next step is, for God's sake, observe the rules. If you want to be respected, that's the way. That's what you have to do, and that's a lesson they have to learn. And before that is happening, forget about all the rest. Yeah.
Thanks. Next question.
I see Florian.
Yeah, good
Oh,
evening.
please.
Thanks
Yeah.
for the, let's say, summary. I wonder, but maybe it's a question of topic, but are the Western leaders kind of still naive? Because I get the impression you might just made a pledge for delivering weapons and really help Ukraine to stand it. But what I have seem to observe is that you just keep them supplied just enough not to die, but certainly not to win. What's behind there? Is that really the fear of the nuclear threat? Is that they still haven't understand it? Is that they are playing dirty games and actually don't want Ukraine to win? Do you have any theories or ideas on what might be behind their behavior?
Yeah. Well, my theory would be, well, it's quite obvious from a developmental point of view that normally, well, what we see, and that's more elaborate in the other presentation that's online, is that most Western leadership is somewhere between orange, green, let's say, very roughly, right? So that's about 3 or 4 levels above where Putin is. And so that's out of reach in both directions, right? Putin cannot understand Western leaders. Western leaders don't understand this lower level logic. And that is part of the problem. If you don't have if you don't have a developmentally informed understanding of this conflict, you always sort of project your own behavioral logic and your own action logic and your own thinking on everybody else, and you wonder why you don't understand how people behave. And it's very difficult for a Western leader who is socialized, in a democratic country and so on and so forth, to imagine that somebody is operating in a leadership position, is operating at such a comparatively not complex level, right, as Putin is doing. So they have come up with all sorts of assumptions. Oh, it must be very strategic, very clever, so clever that we don't understand it. But it's very simple. It's self-protective, and if we take that seriously, it would be very easy also to, well, I've listed those strategies how to confront such a person and how to relate to them. But that is not common wisdom. It's not common knowledge. And that's why people respond with fear and with undecidedness and so on and so forth, because, it's just not part of, let's say, political science education so far to have this developmental perspective.
Elke, don't you also think that, I love your comparisons with Germany, because there is a clear parallel there, obviously, although there's always differences as well. But Hitler, because when the Second World War started, there wasn't this clarity towards Nazi Germany. If that would have been there, then the Second World War would have never happened the way it did, right? And currently, what we see is that Russia is how to say, it's also shown weak, right? And my sense is that Western leaders are not so worried that this war will go beyond Ukraine, which is I don't share that view, but it could also. Do you think that could be a part of this, where they just simply don't imagine that it will be their backyard, and they don't regard Ukraine enough as their own backyard?
Well, yeah, we would have to look at each person, so to speak, to find out what they think, and I mean, we need to speak to them, of course, to get a full picture. But maybe that's true, and that would be part of the naiveness, because somebody like Putin will escalate further as long as you let him escalate. Yeah. On the other hand, I think if you put a very clear stop sign and a very strong stop sign and very clear signals, as it would be possible, yeah, on the basis of what I have laid out, then I'm sure you will see also immediate results. And we have seen that at some point also in the previous years. I don't remember the exact details, but I remember once where the British government said very clearly stop. I think it was in relation with the poisonment of Litvinenko or so, and they reacted in a very, very clear way and say no, this is a red line. And then we had some very surprising stepping back from Putin's side. So it is working, right? But unfortunately, this kind of strategy is applied very rarely. And so I think, yeah, we should do much more of this and be just very clear. And this is the rule, and here's the law, and that's it. End of discussion. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
But of course, we have also inside the West different opinions.
Yes.
And we have Orban and we have Erdogan and all these people, and which doesn't make it easier, of course. And then we have China, and yeah, which supports Russia, and so on and so forth. So it's a complex situation, but in theory, it's quite clear, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark.
Elke, I learned a lot from you about the political system, the whole history of the autocratic governance. But is there any study, or do you have any knowledge where we can learn from what of the people who live in Russia, who are not system, but who are being governed? So what is the state of consciousness? I try to read about it, but it's difficult to grasp it. What is the state of mind of the millions of Russians who are not in the power?
That's a very difficult question, because for a long time we don't have free polls anymore. And I mean, I do follow all sorts of coverage in the media, of course, but I haven't been studying that specifically. So it's really just educated guesses that I can make. Of course, Russian society is much more educated nowadays, but this lack of political education, in the sense of critical thinking, that has been so much forced really in Germany after the war. We have an official, we call it Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, which has an official state mission to really politically educate people towards democracy, right? This is not happening in Russia. And you can say anything about the past, which means Stalin is a hero, and so on and so forth. And that's, I don't know if it's a majority opinion, but you find all sorts of restorative also politics of memory, right? You find statues of Stalin and all the rest of it, and that's all moving into a restorative direction. On the same time, you have, of course, all those educated people who have, I mean, many of them have left the country, right? Because they have access to Western media, and they have the mental capacity and all the rest of it to really follow what's going on, and to have a clear picture of what's going on in Russia. But that's still, I think that's the educated maybe not just intelligentsia, but the educated parts of the population in the cities and so on. And if you go into the countryside, you get a different picture. But I haven't studied that, and would be really a big endeavor to do so. But yeah, that's why I looked back into the past and to say, well, what can be the preconditions with that history and with that lack of experience of a different kind of political system. There can be no experience, and we can maybe make inferences from that, but that doesn't, of course, make up for good research, which is difficult at the moment.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. There's 2 more questions. I think it's very valuable what we are doing right now, so I'll let them go, but let's see if we can we're going over time a little bit. So Anita first, and then Barbara, and then we go to the next section.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elke, for your explanation. It was beautiful to see, and to see how you've used the integral model. I really appreciate it. And I also, it was kind of fun to see how much I recognized from how you explain how to treat a leader like Russia, like Putin, with a lot of healthy blue. I've worked for decades in child protection, so I've worked with children where this kind of parenting, of upbringing was very important. And also that I experienced hands-on first through working with it, how delicate that kind of laying down a law is. Too much aggression is totally counterproductive, and it sanctifies aggression among the children. You lose the kids with being way too strong or way too aggressive. And when I look at how internationally we've made mistakes in the past, like the bombing of Cambodia in Vietnam directly created the Khmer Rouge. And so it's such a delicate balance to really be clear and then not overstep, right? Can you say anything to that?
This was more a comment than a question, right? And of course, it's a very delicate balance also in terms of, well, who are we, to declare that we have a higher morality or something, which is also quite difficult, and especially for greenish values. But I think, Elke, in your last presentation that you gave in one of our salons about Ukraine, you talked about that in a very convincing way, saying, well, the West has to do some of its homework, right, and become much more clear and improve their PR, no more selling wars for the wrong reason, etc., etc. So that's also part of it, right? It's not just about being very clear towards Russia. It's also about a self-reflection, where what do we have to learn, and what learnings do we have to integrate into a different kind of politics that is less naive, and that is based on this perception of reality that is more developmentally informed. What does this imply for us, right? Yeah. And so there's some work to do there as well. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. Or maybe you can.
Yeah, I think it's not about who are we to do it, because we have we have the role and the right. It's not who are we to lay down the law, but how do we do it?
Mm. Yeah, I'm not sure if I heard you correctly in the beginning, that you said with your experience with kids that putting down rules can be difficult. And one thing that crosses my mind there is what Claire Graves said about this in this case, the CP, the red person, which is different from the self-protective still, but similar. And he says, well, sanctions don't work, punishment doesn't work, because that's all, it's conventional. sanctions and punishment only works when you have a conventional level awareness of norms that are somehow integrated into your self-system. If you don't have that, it won't work. So you cannot work with sanctions, you cannot work with punishment. You just have to be, as he calls it, tough paternalistic, right? You have to lay down the rules and make sure that every time they overstep the rules, be there with an immediate response, but not in terms of punishing them, but saying, no, this is not correct. Exactly. Try again, and right? Do it again until you get it. That's
no exceptions.
Yeah, no exception, and you have to redo it maybe 20 times until they understand, okay, here's a boundary that I better respect, otherwise I will get tapped upon or something.
That's what we should have done in 2014, right? That would have been a moment
at the
to
very
start.
latest. I mean, there were many earlier occasions.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, the bells should have been ringing, but
exactly.
Yeah.
Georgia in 2008. And,
Exactly. Yeah.
Good. Last one, shortly, Barbara, please.
The U.S. has a history of supporting not very democratic regimes for their own nasty purposes, and one of the feelings that seems to be coming from this side of the pond now is that there's not a strong feeling that Ukraine is on a democratic path either. We're seeing all sorts of corruption, including some from the first son, right, around Ukraine. And so, where do you see Ukraine, Elke? Do you see it? It seems as if it's further along than Russia, but certainly not fully on the European path. What would help the Yanks to see it as something with promise rather than just a black hole that's another dictatorship?
That's again quite a difficult question, because I haven't studied Ukraine, I have to say, really. So I would rather give that question to Katarina if she's still there. But I mean, two things maybe I can say from also this historical looking back. It's that Ukraine has had a completely different history for most of the time. It has not been part of this autocratic empire, but of other empires which have been more, as I said, more pluralistic, religious pluralism, more self-management, self-organization, etc. All the rest of it, that has been more part of at least the Western Ukrainian tradition, and it seems to be very well anchored in people's culture, and we see that now, right? And that's something that was surprising for many, including myself, because I just hadn't really studied Ukraine. I had decided I'm going to study the difficult ones, right? Russia, the hard ones in terms of democratization, because the others can do without my help, so to speak. But then again, in the last 2 years with this whole conflict and the war, I think Ukraine and the society has gone through a huge acceleration process of transformation, unseen, right? And I haven't been there myself, so I can only speak from what I'm hearing and following in the media and from conversations and so forth. But I think that there is a huge difference between those two countries in terms of political culture and tradition and self-identification and all the rest of it. But maybe over to somebody else who is more qualified to answer that question.
Okay.
And Americans aren't seeing it, right, at this point, which is
Sorry?
really, and Americans aren't seeing that at this point, which is not a good thing.
No.
Well, Americans have a hard time finding Ukraine on the map in general, and any country that is not America for the most part. But that's another conversation.
Come on, it's over on that side of the pond. I mean,
yeah, the right side of the pond, but that's it, right? No, okay. I mean, who from among the Germans would have been able to spot Ukraine on the map before the war started? I don't know. Yeah, it's a general lack of political education, maybe, that we can deplore.
Well, and to be honest, from
okay, so
an age of 70, it's changed.
In the interest of time, I just want to give a couple of minutes time to Katrina on this topic, And now we'd really like to move on to, and we can still go on to these conversations later in the smaller groups, but I also would like us to have some time for the rest of our program. So, Katrina, can you say a few words on this?
Very welcome.
I got the book here, so.
Thank you very much, Leida and Elke, and of course, our dear friend Elke, for such a grounded analysis. We are both, my colleague Lilia, who is here today as well, and we were just exchanging messages a few minutes ago that it seems like you're a true treasure in terms of your knowledge and expertise, and very helpful for Ukraine in order to convey some important messages about our neighbor that we cannot articulate. Yes, I'm also grateful for this question. It calls for, Barbara, it calls for consciousness and awareness and reflection and serious integral approach. I probably would sound a little strange if I would not accept the reality that it is challenging now in Ukraine. We are going through very challenging times. At the same time, there is, believe me or not, there is no danger for Ukraine's democracy. Ukraine is a baby democracy, and it needs support. But it's a strong, it is very well rooted in the cultural code that was just described by Elke. We have very vast and substantial historical tradition, starting from Kazakh times and Kievan Rus, that had in the 10th, 11th century, Ukraine and Kiev was bigger than London, bigger than Paris, and it had 5 markets. Self-organization in terms of this piece of democracy building has been very well structured, and Ukraine has very long democratic traditions. So you do not need to be very much afraid. Of course, during the wartime, it is very complicated because someone has to take power and take responsibility. And since the war is unfolding for such a long time, it is very hard for Ukraine to hold democratic elections or elections in general. But there is very little chance of autocracy. The Ukrainian society and civic society in particular is extremely strong. So I hope that we will have our chance to express ourselves as long as the situation changes and the war is not that close to our doors. Thank you.
Thanks, Katerina. Last thing I want to do is mention this book, Barbara. You'll find it really interesting because it's from Mikhail Vinitsky. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's called Ukraine's Maiden Russia's War. And it gives a fantastic analysis of this democratic process that has been going on in Ukraine. And if you compare this to what Elke has just presented, you see very clearly the difference. I'll make sure there's links in the chat about that. Okay.